Hi, my name is Jessica Bell. I'm a social studies teacher at St. George's High School. I teach 12th grade world history, and today's lesson involves what happened to the Maya. So this lesson is kind of a combination between a history lab and sort of an executive questioning exercise. I do this with my 12th grade students in world history, and world history at St. George's is a rigorous course. It is intended for students who are going on to college. And so this year what we've really tried to do is put in a good literacy component to kind of bump up our lessons a little bit. And hopefully this has kind of done that for my seniors. So we start off by asking a question. The lesson immediately preceding this one is a broad overview of Mesoamerican society. So we're talking about civilizations like the Olmec and the Toltec. We're talking about how people came to be into Central and South America. This lesson really gets into the Maya, who they are, and what happened to them. Immediately after this lesson, we're going to talk about different parts of their culture. We're going to really get to know them as a people. But we're going to start off talking about what happened to them. So what we do is students are presented when they walk in with a source document. I have 5 different source documents, and they're all lettered A through E. You can choose to do this randomly as students walk in. You have an A, you have a B, a C, or a D. If you know your class and you know certain students are going to work well together, you can certainly group them that way as well. Mine turned out to be random. So my students came in. My desks were arranged into different groups throughout the classroom, and they were numbered. I'm sorry, they were lettered. All the A's sat together, the B's sat together, so on and so forth. So everybody who had source A, for example, and you guys will have electronic copies of these documents, was talking about the fall of the Maya being basically the fault of the Maya through some bad decisions having to do with farming and sustaining their crops. Everyone in Group A discussed this document together. Group B discussed their document, which had to do with maybe religious beliefs led to the downfall of the Maya. Group C discussed their document, which was maybe it was warfare and different parts of their civilization that led to their demise. Group D spoke about political strife, and Group E together talked more about some of these Spanish and European invasion towards the end of the Mayan period, and if that could have had something to do with the final downfall. While they were in their groups, they filled out a graphic organizer for their specific source. The graphic organizer asked for a summary of their source. It asked for some analysis or impact on of what their document had on them. And it talked about how likely it was that this specific theory was correct. So I allowed about 12 to 15 minutes, depending upon the class, with just their source document groups. Then each document also had a number at the bottom. And these were pre-numbered before class started, 1 through 5. After that 12 to 15 minute period was over, everybody got into their numbered groups. So in each group 1 through 5, someone representing source A, B, C, D, and E was present. You might have to finagle this a little bit depending upon how many people you have in your class, but try to get it so that each group has a subject matter expert for each source. While they were in their groups, they again went back to the graphic organizer, and now source A had 5 minutes to talk about their document and its impact. Source B had 5 minutes to do the same, and so on and so forth. So at the end of 25 minutes, everybody had had a chance to learn about all of the documents. What's important in this part is that not everybody had to agree with the theory. So maybe the original person who presented source C said, yep, we all agreed with the theory, it sounded good to us. When they got into their numbered groups, everyone could kind of have their own opinion. So once this was all done and everybody had a chance to look at the documents and figure out maybe one of these tiny little pieces that went towards answering the question of what happened to the Maya, then we moved on to the questioning function. So there are 4 steps to the questioning part of this exercise, and I kind of did one step at a time with the class. The first step was I wrote the question on the board of what happened to the Maya, and I asked them to create a series of 10 questions that could help them answer that question. So the difficult part here, I think, is having students think about asking questions to answer a question. So often when we're presented with a question, we're trying to think of factual statements and evidence to back that up. And in fact, that's what the documents are. The documents are factual statements and evidence used to answer the question. But I wanted them to get beyond that. I wanted to know what the documents really told them and what kind of questioning techniques those documents would allow them to analyze within their groups. So they create the series of 10 questions that are based on all 5 documents. A good rule of thumb, obviously, you have 10 questions and 5 documents, was how about 2 questions for each document? And so what I did right there was I had them use a piece of big chart paper. Love big chart paper in social studies. And I wanted them to come up with 10 questions just off the cuff. Okay, and they wrote those down on the chart paper, questions 1 through 10. So each one of my groups created one of these. Then after they had some time to do that, and you do want to allow enough time because you really want them to get into the documents and look for those questions. My challenge to them was try to come up with a question that you don't think any other group is going to come up with, right? I don't just want you to ask a recall question. I want you to ask something we really have to think about. Step 2 was improve upon your questions. I asked them to go through and circle each one of the questions that was close-ended. I didn't want any yes or no answers. I didn't want any single word answers. And I asked them if they had any close-ended questions, which many of the groups did. I wanted them to turn them into open-ended questions for me. And we went over some techniques of how to do that, adding a why or a how, changing the wording of your question so that really people had to think about this answer and look for it within the document. Once that was done, I asked them for their 3 best questions. And they went through, and some groups kind of argued about it a little bit, and they came up with their 3 best questions. From there, I asked them to take the 3 questions and turn it into just one absolute best question. And they were able to do that pretty easily. Most of them seemed to have their favorite when they put the 3 questions down in the first place. After everybody had their one favorite question, I put a fresh piece of chart paper up on the board, and I asked one representative from each group to come up and write their question on the chart paper. So essentially what we created was a class list of the absolute best questions that we can answer to get us to find out what happened to the Mayan civilization. If we can answer these questions, in theory, we figure out what happened, or at least our interpretation of what happened. So that was the end of that class lesson, and I told them, I promise you, you'll see these questions again. So when they came up the next day, I had those questions as their warm-up. Now I teach 2 world history classes, which made this kind of easy. I made one column that had all of the questions from one class and one column that had all the questions from another class. And I asked my students to choose a question from each column. That way I kind of made sure that they weren't just picking the question their group wrote that they knew the answer to. They could pick that question, they could show me their answer to it, but they also had to pick one from a different group as well. And that kind of forced them to broaden their horizons a little bit. We haven't taken the unit test on this yet, but I think they'll be surprised when they see that some of these questions were just so good and thoughtful that maybe they made it on as a choice for one of our essay questions for the unit test as well. Hi, it's Jessica Bell again, the world history lesson about the Maya civilization. So this little reflection piece I think is super important because in history I know that we use documents a lot. We do a lot of lessons that have to do with literacy. They have a literacy component to them. The problem is that I think sometimes we're using them as content, which is okay, but we're using them as content in a way that we don't really follow up on. And we're not really teaching so much how to read the documents as much as we are just giving the information and saying, all right, let's apply this information somewhere down the road, or let's use this document just to reinforce something we've already learned. So what I really wanted to do with this lesson was not just give documents that would give information, because we can do that in so many different ways. I wanted to take advantage of the fact that they were reading documents and they were analyzing these documents. And I wanted to actually teach them a skill through the questioning that I thought they could use down the road, even if it's not in class, even if it's a way for them to study or a way for them to get more information in college. So how did the lesson go? The lesson went well. I have a really good group of seniors, and they kind of take things and they roll with them with very little guidance and instruction. So my role in all of this was just sort of an observer, was someone who was walking around making sure people were on track, and of course the timekeeper to say, all right, the 5 minutes have been up, time to get our next source on the books. And with very little interference in things, it kind of ran itself. My suggestion would be if you've never done something like a history lab before, where they're looking at documents and they're jigsawing, and there are a lot of moving parts, my suggestion might be to take maybe 10 minutes, make a PowerPoint presentation that says, hey, here's what it looks like, here are some steps to it, this is what we're going to do. So it went well. Our ultimate goal and our product of all of this was the analysis of the sources, of course, but more so I think the questions were the really meaningful part to me. Something I would do differently. I would model the kind of questions I was looking for immediately before the lesson, or maybe during the lesson. I think that I relied too much on saying things like, oh, I'm looking for a higher level question. I'm looking for analysis. And I think I used a lot of teacher buzzwords that maybe just didn't resonate with my students. So I would maybe show them some examples. I did say a couple times, think back to your test. Think back to an essay question I would give you. And I think that they knew what to do, but when it came down to it, some of their questions were definitely on that level, and some maybe weren't. Another thing that I might do is involve different kinds of documents. So the documents I had in here were primarily secondary source documents. I didn't have many primary source documents. Just given the topic, it was hard to find material that was truncated enough for us to use. But I would definitely look for some different ways to get that information to them. What's a cool thing I think about this lesson, though, is it's easy to adapt. So once you have that information, once they've done the analysis, and once they've written those questions, you can use these questions for such a variety of things. If we'd had more time, I might have even had groups swap their questions and come up with answers for the questions. You can apply them to a bunch of different things, however it works in your classroom. So I think all in all, every lesson that I do, I find something at the end where I say, you know what, next time I'm going to do it a different way. But all in all, I think it was meaningful, and I think it really helped the students in their understanding of the Mayan civilization, and definitely helped to build upon what we had coming down the road for Mesoamerica.